Hello, everyone. Welcome back for those who have seen no neuropsychology lectures before. And if you're new, thank you for joining. My name is Dr. Casey Hewitt, and for the summer, Annie Reyes and I will be your moderators. We are pleased that you could join us for this week's lecture in our first 7-week No Neuroanatomy mini-series that brings you lectures from experts in the field covering neuroanatomy topics each week. This series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists to provide free, high-quality didactic opportunities. We would also like to recognize our No Neuroanatomy planning group for their hard work for pulling this mini-series off. We would also like to thank our sponsors for their financial support for the series. Now, before we start, here are the disclaimers for the series. This training is not meant to replace formal education in neuropsychology, and the views of the speakers are their own. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A box on the lower left side of your screen, and a recording of today's lecture will be provided on our website later this week. Questions will be asked at the end and not during the lecture. Today's Q&A is led by Annie Reyes. Now, No Neuropsychology is excited to announce the call for new members, applicants who have little to no formal leadership or service experience and who are from historically marginalized and excluded backgrounds in psychology are encouraged to apply. All psychology graduate students, interns, postdoctoral fellows, and neuropsychologists are eligible to apply. The call for members will be distributed across different listservs and our social media this week. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Pillay for today's lecture titled Neuroanatomy of Language. Dr. Pillay is a clinical neuropsychologist and assistant professor at the Department of Neurology at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee before earning a PhD in clinical psychology from Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. She then completed a clinical psychology internship at Clement J. Zabocki VA Medical Center, followed by a 2-year fellowship specializing in neuropsychology at Medical College of Wisconsin. Dr. Pillay's research background has primarily focused on examining the neural organization of phonological-based language in patients with aphasia, work that was supported by a pre-doctoral fellowship from the American Heart Association. Currently, she's investigating the neural and behavioral changes that occur in patients with chronic aphasia after they receive a process-focused speech therapy intervention, coupled with transcranial direct current stimulation. This work is supported by a K-12 scholar grant from the NIH National Center for Medical Rehabilitation Research and hopes to inform future development of translational clinical rehabilitation tools that further support recovery.
Great, thank you for the wonderful introduction and the opportunity to go through a little bit of a blitz of the neuroanatomy of language. I'm going to share my screen here, so bear with me for 1 second. All right, and we're going to kind of go through, I have some basic objectives. We're going to talk about defining language. We're going to discuss the difference between tasks and processes that are involved in performing those tasks. The main goal of this lecture is to identify different neuroanatomical correlates of these different processes. And then as we kind of go through, because this is a neuropsychology focused group, we're really interested in that brain behavior relationship. And so we're going to talk about how damage to some of these regions can result in different types of language disorders as we go through. I'll make it a little bit more interesting. So I think this is kind of a varied group in terms of background knowledge. I know you guys had an introductory lecture the other week just to kind of refresh some of those terms, right? We have orientation terms like rostral is towards the nose, caudal is towards the back of the head, dorsal is at the top, ventral is at the bottom, medial is toward the middle, lateral is towards the outside. You have the planes of view when we're looking at images. So if I cut through the brain, like here on this green slice here, that's an axial view. Coronal would be blue if I'm kind of cutting down this way through the brain, and sagittal is that side view. As I go through, I'm going to show just a few white matter tracks as well in DTI or diffusion tensor imaging. The basic understanding of what DTI is looking at is really just telling us the direction that these white matter tracts are going in the brain at its simplest understanding. And this is a visualization tool that I use when I teach this lecture to our fellows, because the direction of different white matter tracts is color coded. Okay, it's red, green, and blue. Red is always indicating a left to right pathway. Green is always anterior to posterior, okay? And blue is always superior to inferior. So the visualization tool that I like to use is that imagine there's a pitcher of water being poured down at the top of your head and it flows down, right? So you remember blue water, it flows up and down. And then imagine a floret of broccoli growing in your brain, and it kind of grows from the front to the back of the brain. It fills it up, right? So now you remember green is broccoli. It goes from anterior to posterior. And because you have a bunch of broccoli in your brain now, those ladybugs get hungry and they come in through your ear and they go to the other side, and that's left to right. Okay, so that's red for left to right. So just kind of keep that in mind, that sometimes challenging to remember which color is in which direction, and sometimes a visualization is a little bit easier. All right, so before we talk about the anatomy of language, we have to talk about what language is, right? It's a system of communication. It utilizes a variety of different arbitrary systems that convey meaning, okay? It's unique. We don't really have a good animal model for studying language functioning, so we can really only study it in detail in humans. And it's very, very important to patients, right? It's something that we try to preserve if patients are undergoing surgical resection of a tumor or for epilepsy. It's often a focus for rehabilitation after stroke. And if you ask patients that have both a physical and a verbal deficit after stroke, they often have a stronger desire to be able to communicate better than to walk unassisted without a cane. You'll hear the term, language dominant or the dominant hemisphere, and that's really just referring to where language is specialized. For the majority of right-handers, that would be in the left hemisphere, and that's the same is true as actually for left-handers. 60 to 70% also have language specialized or dominant in their left hemisphere. This is not to say that language does not happen in the right hemisphere or bilaterally represented. It just means that that part of the brain is really critical for that language function. And if you disrupt it, you're likely going to see a deficit. There are lots of different subcomponents to language. There's orthography, which is the rules that govern writing. It's the relationship between phonemes, which is the sound of the word, and graphemes, which is how it looks, right? So your ability to read the slide requires on you having an intact orthographic process. Phonology is the organization of sounds in language. It's the ability for me to retrieve an abstract phonological representation of the words that I want to say, right? So that I'm selecting the right sounds. It's my ability for all of you to be able to perceive and hear the words that I'm saying. All involve phonology. There's semantics, right? Which is what we know about the world and word meaning. There's motor and articulatory components, right? So knowing where my tongue and my teeth are when I'm speaking. There's prosody and tone, right? So that sing-songy quality as we talk, and it's not monotone, hopefully. There's syntax, right? Which is sentence level word ordering, right? So the example is the red coat versus the coat that was red. That's all syntax. And then there's pragmatics, right? Which are contributions of context to meaning, social aspects, humor, sarcasm, etc. I'm not going to touch too much on the last two. I will a little bit as we go through the lecture, but this is kind of a whirlwind tour, and if I touched on all of it, we'd be getting the entire brain, and I'll even try and bring in the cerebellum here a little bit as well. Okay. Let's talk about something that I've noticed in my experience working with trainees is talking about the difference between a task and a process, okay? Picture naming is a task, and it's made up of lots of different processes. And understanding this difference will really help you understand the neurobiology of language better, and help you understand this relationship between anatomy and function, okay? It's really, really critical because picture naming is a task we use all the time. It's a really, really complicated task, okay? Oh, wrong way. So let's say I want to name an apple, okay? I name the picture, all right? First thing that happens, right, is I look at it and it goes into visual input, right? So my occipital lobes are decoding what I'm seeing. And then I can abstract this to, kind of visual form, right? So there's kind of two curved lines. There's kind of the squiggly line at the bottom. There's a stem, right? And that can get combined into this concept, right? Where here it's devoid of unique features, right? Because not every apple is red, some are green. Not every apple has a beautiful little leaf attached to the stem. Some have none, some have no stems at all. And this is devoid of all of that extra meaning. This is really just the concept, okay? So now I know what this is. Now I have to map this and retrieve the sounds for what this object is, apple, put that all together into an emotor and articulatory process so that I can say apple out loud. And these are the types of processes that we try to localize to different neuroanatomical regions, right? And some processes are more distributed and they involve several different areas to create a network, like semantics, okay? And as we kind of go through, you can see how naming a picture, right, is probably really sensitive to disruption because it involves lots of different processes, but it's not very specific because if I can't name this, any one of these could be damaged and trying to understand and break that down. All right. So we talked a little bit about seeing an object. You could also see a word, right, where you have visual features, you get the relative position of the letters, you get whole word orthography, and then you can kind of see the word as mouse. And when we think about where some of these things happen in the brain for visual input, right, it goes into your primary occipital lobe, right? And you're thinking about, V1, V2, and then it kind of spans out into more higher order visual perceptual cortices. So here would be the lateral occipital area. Okay, and on the next slide, we'll kind of go through some of these gyri and identifying them, as well as a area ventrally underneath the temporal lobe. And this is really important for linking the visual object with the conceptual name, okay? And that Hans Luters back in the 80s with epilepsy patients stimulated the ventral area of the temporal lobe. And these are all these stimulation sites where it elicited an error in being able to retrieve the name of a picture. It's not that these patients had conceptually lost the knowledge of, what an apple was, but they can no longer link the picture to the name. And in epilepsy patients, right, as you're kind of seeing right here in the bottom, so this is the underside of the brain. This is the cerebellum, all right? This is left on this case. On this ventral temporal area. This is an area where when it's resected or cut out for epilepsy surgery, it results in a decline in patients' ability to name pictures on the Boston naming test. All right, so let's try and label some of these areas a little bit more. So this is a nice sagittal view of the brain. For those that aren't too familiar, up here would be your eyes. Here's the back of your head. Maybe I can swap my pointers here. Okay. This is, right, the frontal lobe. right up here. It's the only lobe that's really demarcated by anatomical landmarks. So I've got the central sulcus down here, and it's demarcated down at the bottom by the Sylvian fissure, or the lateral fissure. This is a temporal lobe here, down here. Parietal lobe is up here, okay? And this is the occipital lobe. So if we're gonna label some of these areas that are important for visual processing, this top one right up here is the superior occipital gyrus. Right here in the middle, O2, as you can kind of see, is the middle occipital gyrus. And right here down at the bottom, this is the inferior occipital gyrus. And there's no clear boundary between the parietal and occipital or temporal lobes here. As we go through this, we can also start labeling in some of the sulci, right? So this one going across, this is a transverse occipital sulcus. Going down is the superior occipital sulcus. If it is present, the middle occipital sulcus just divides the middle occipital gyrus into a superior and an inferior division. This one right here at the end of the middle occipital gyrus is called the sulcus lunatus. And down here at the bottom, number 34, is the inferior occipital sulcus as well, okay? So this region right here, this lateral occipital region, is really important for that higher level visual decoding. On the underside or ventral view of the brain, right? So here would be the top of the temporal lobe. Right up here, this is frontal, okay? And back here, that's occipital on both sides. You can't see the parietal lobe because that would be on the dorsal view and the brain is flipped here. This is the inferior occipital gyrus right here, just so you can kind of see it. We saw that on the previous slide, all right? This sulcus right here running down the length of the ventral temporal lobe is called the collateral sulcus. And this one right here, number 16, this is a fusiform gyrus. And this is that gyrus that is really important for integrating that visual object identification with its name, right? So if you think about kind of the what and where visual streams, if you've heard those terms where is that dorsal visual stream and what is that ventral visual stream, it makes sense, right? Information comes in through your eyes, through your occipital system, or sorry, your optic system in to the occipital lobes, and then it gets shipped out to other parts of the brain where it gets processed, okay? And that's why this area is really important for that visual information, this fusiform area, okay? You might have heard several terms for it: fusiform face area, visual word form area. You maybe have heard different distinctions of it for processing faces or houses or things like that. What I want you to just keep in mind is that this underside is important for object identification. Thinking about words, okay, it's the same. I just mentioned visual word form area. This region is also very important for identifying written words, okay? So this area right here, this fusiform gyrus, has a lot of really important processes that you can see. This is just a schematic of word reading, right? And here we're focusing on this area. So this visual input here in blue, okay, down to this ventral occipital temporal area, or the visual word form area, and then it gets shipped out to other areas in the cortex so that you can read the words. Over here, what this is just showing is some functional imaging research that is showing how preferentially this area responds to words like table, right? You can kind of see that over just consonant strings, like just letters in order that would have no meaning. So it's really, really specialized. And the same thing happens about 150 milliseconds after the appearance of words on the retina. Okay, so it happens very early on, which is what you're seeing here from a MEG study, okay? And in fact, the reading circuit is so determined that the visual word form area is actually activated in congenitally blind adults as they read Braille or when they identify letters through an auditory modality using a sight to sound sensory substitution device. So there's something really specialized about this area for reading, as well as for naming pictures and object identification. As I talked a little bit about that, what visual system, right? You could think that the inferior longitudinal fasciculus is the white matter path that's really important for that. Here, remember that mnemonic of green. I know it's going to run anterior to posterior, right? And if you can't tell, this is the frontal lobe right here. This is the parietal lobe, occipital, and then this is the temporal lobe down here. And here is that inferior longitudinal fasciculus kind of tracking down the temporal lobe right there, okay? Here, this is just an axial view, all right? So this is brainstem, this would be frontal lobe up here, and this would be the temporal lobe, temporal toward the front, and occipital lobe here in the back. And again, it's tracking information from the occipital lobe down into the temporal lobe. All right. When it's damaged, right? So here, this is damage after a posterior cerebral artery stroke, okay? And it's just showing serial flare images on the axial view, right? And you can see something doesn't look right in that area, okay? And this patient would present with like an alexia, okay? In this study, this case study that was presented by Turkeltaub and colleagues, what they're showing here is series of axial flare images where a patient had an infarct in that left occipital temporal sulcus area, right by that fusiform area that we're talking about. And again, he had an alexia, right, where he had this very laborious letter by letter reading strategy. And there was an effective word length, right? So as the words get longer, this patient would have a harder time reading those words because it takes a lot more to kind of process, okay? All right, let's talk a little bit about auditory input. So we talked about phonology in being able to perceive as well as when I speak, right? So there's kind of two aspects of phonology. We're going to talk about auditory input now, which is the phonological perception of a word's form sound, right? So you all listening to me speak right now are activating this system. It's a very early perceptual process, and then it will link to conceptual information for comprehension, right? We listen because we're learning and things like that. When we talk about phonological perception, human vocalizations include the set of sounds that are called phonemes, right? They are the basic linguistic units of speech. The phonemes are approximately equivalent to a set of a vowel or consonant sounds of language. So as you can see, the word cat has 3 phonemes that are transcribed there, k, a, t, right? And you can change a phoneme and get a different word like pat or cot or cat, and etc. And then the smallest contrastive speech unit that can help bring about change in meaning. They vary across geographical and social groups, right? Like accents, we can hear those all the time. And that's an abstract representation of a set of related speech sounds that are perceived as equivalent within a given language, right? So I might hear a speaker from down south and hear that difference. Okay, it's still the same letter. I'm still able to map it onto something. If I was in my geographical area and hearing slight variations in accent, I perceive them to be all the same, though. I don't hear that subtle difference that I might hear from an outside speaker. And phonemes are classified based on their motor gestures. Okay, and those distinctions associate with corresponding acoustic phenomena. So some different motor classifications of phonemes are stops or plosives. This is a transient closure of the vocal tract, like p, d, and k, like p, d, and k when you make those sounds. There are fricatives, which is a sustained constriction of the vocal tract, and it results in a turbulent airflow. So think of F or TH or S, right? So I'm if you were to measure that with like a high speed camera, so if you can actually see the air moving in front of my mouth. There's a nasal sound, right, which is lowering the soft palate. You relax the upper pharynx during occlusion of the oral tract. It allows airflow and resonance into the nasal cavity, right? So all those sounds, okay, they happen kind of up nasally. And then vowel, right? Those are unobstructive phonations using the tongue and lips to shape the resonant properties of the oral tract. When we look at our perception of speech versus non-speech control sounds, and this is a meta-analysis of 22 different fMRI studies, and you can see that in the superior temporal gyrus area, there's a really, really strong and robust activation for this contrast, right? So I'm really identifying those speech sounds that are really important for language. And acoustic waveforms for sentences that carry a lot of information. And what I just want you to take away from the slide is that the superior temporal gyrus encodes many different types of acoustic features. And what they're just showing down here is that there's even a distinction within that gyrus of different types of information that it's responding to, okay? So you can kind of see, I talked about plosives and fricatives, and you can kind of see how it's responding to some of these within the superior temporal gyrus, okay? The blue and red correspond to kind of the onset of times. There's even changes in the peak rate of amplitude as you guys are listening to things that happens more in the anterior superior temporal gyrus. It's useful for knowing when vowels occur in a sentence versus in the posterior area. That's important for onset from silence, right? So knowing when a phrase occurs, and that happens more in the posterior region. So looking at a brain, here, the superior aspect has been kind of removed, so you can see underneath it. So I'm going to start with this brain over here, and then I'll go down here. But again, this is the frontal lobe, okay? This is parietal, occipital, and this is temporal, okay? This is that really big longitudinal lateral, sorry, not longitudinal, latitude, the lateral sulcus, sorry, or the Sylvian fissure is what I typically refer to it. The first gyrus here, okay, this would be the superior temporal gyrus, okay, this whole long thing. Right? This is the middle temporal gyrus. And then here on 16, right, that I'm kind of highlighting, this is a transverse temporal gyri, or Heschel's gyrus. And that is really, really that important area for phonological perceptual information. Down here on this figure over here, what's basically been cut away is all of this area up here has been removed so that you can see underneath, all right? Again, this is that Heschel's gyrus that we kind of identified up here on 16. It's probably getting confusing with all my highlighter. This back period or back area here is a planum temporale. So let me just erase everything here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So in the Sylvian fissure, right, this piece of cortex folds into the brain medially, and that's what they're showing right here. And this is that kind of plane of the temporal gyrus, and it's called the planum temporale. And you can see how this part of the cortex kind of goes in. And you can have a really nice shot of the insula, which I think most people are used to identifying in either the axial or the coronal plane. It's kind of the squiggly thing we'll talk about. Again, these areas right here are really important for decoding phonological information. In terms of a neuropsychological deficit, you maybe have heard the term pure word deafness, right? So these patients are unable to recognize or repeat spoken words, but they have normal understanding of written language, normal production. It's not an aphasia, right? Because that would be multimodality. And typically it's from a bilateral superior temporal gyrus lesion. There have been cases after unilateral damage that's rare and nearly always in the left side. And one of the theories is that it's a disconnection, right? Deficit where information that is perceived in the right is disconnected from that specialized area in the dominant hemisphere. Pure word deafness is slightly misleading to some degree because it does involve deficits in the perception of phonemes, not just words. So if I ask people to recognize just basic ba, bloy, things like that, they would also have difficulty with that. Okay. All right, so let's shift gear here a little bit and talk about semantics. Okay, so tell me everything you know about a mouse, right? And maybe you can think of all sorts of things about mice, right? You can think of cartoon mice, you can think about their physical characteristics, their behavior, maybe you think about like a computer mice, and that kind of branches into things, and these connections become a network, right? When we look at where this area is important in the brain, semantics, right? So everything that I knew about a mouse is semantic information. That's located in these red areas in the brain. This is from a meta-analysis of 120 different functional neuroimaging studies of and identifying where in the brain is the semantic system and healthy controls. And up here in red, right, we have the superior frontal gyrus, okay, and that is bounded by the superior frontal sulcus right here, okay. That leads right up into the precentral sulcus and gyrus, right? This is your central sulcus motor area, if you can kind of use that as a landmark. Coming on the medial or middle side of the brain, right? So if I just kind of split open the brain, I'm looking on the inside now. This is the superior aspect of the superior frontal gyrus, and it would also be another name for this area combined is called the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, right? Dorsal, it's on the top, medial, it's in the middle, prefrontal, it's near the prefront of the frontal lobe, and cortex because it's not actually a lobe or a gyrus, okay? It's important to be precise when you're using anatomical terms. Down here, this would be ventral medial prefrontal cortex, right? So ventral, it's on the bottom, medial, it's towards the middle, prefrontal cortex, also involved in semantics. Going back out here on the lateral side of the sagittal view of cartoon brain here. So this is the inferior frontal sulcus that I'm highlighting right here, okay? And then down right underneath it is the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, it's got three parts, right? The one that I'm kind of highlighting right now, that is the pars triangularis, because it makes a nice triangle shape. Down below in red is the pars orbitalis, and back here is the pars opercularis. The orbitalis is really involved in semantic information, retrieval of semantic information. Going into the temporal lobe right here, remember we have the superior temporal gyrus right up here at the top. And underneath it is the middle temporal gyrus, and that is bounded by the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. Back here, we have the angular gyrus, very important area for semantic information. On the medial surface here, this is the posterior cingulate gyrus, right? The cingulate gyrus would kind of run along corpus callosum, which is this white matter area right here, allows the two brain hemispheres to talk to one another. And right back here is a posterior cingulate gyrus. Kind of on the ventral surface on the medial, the parahippocampal gyrus, right, that abuts the hippocampal area. And then again, on the underside, the fusiform gyrus, and just highlighting that collateral sulcus again for you guys as well, right? Relating this back to different types of diseases and semantic dementia, right, which is usually a bilateral anterior temporal lobe atrophic process. You can see that compared to healthy controls, that thinning really starts to affect a lot of that rich semantic area, which results in a semantic dementia or a semantic variant of the primary progressive aphasia, right? They have a really hard time retrieving conceptual information. This is just a case example of a stroke, right? To orient you, this is the eye up here. This is the ear canal. This is the back of the brain. All right. And here, this is at Sylvian fissure. Okay. This would be the central sulcus going up. Okay. This is parietal. You can see that the middle temporal gyrus here has been damaged by the stroke. And you can look at this patient's performance. They really have a hard time linking and accessing semantic conceptual knowledge, right? You look at their ability to tell you what a king wears on its head, or to look at movies and see if a sentence describes what they're watching. And they really struggle doing that and linking that information because it's hard to retrieve semantic information. And in chronic stroke patients, this is the area you can see here in yellow that has the highest overlap, that when it's lesioned will result in an auditory to sentence combinatorial deficit, right? So they really have a hard time linking that information to that they hear to conceptual information. All right, let's talk a little bit about phonological retrieval. So this is that process where I'm retrieving phonological information to say it out loud, right? And we can do this even without having to speak at all, because as we'll talk, as soon as I start speaking, right, I've confounded it with articulatory codes, right? So if I make an error when I'm speaking or I'm naming a picture, how do you know whether it was I had a hard time retrieving the sound versus I messed something up in articulation? To demonstrate that these are dissociable, right, silently read this top word and then tell me, or on your own, just kind of decide which one rhymes with the top word. You don't have to say it out loud. You can hear it in your head. So if you're one of those slow readers like me that hears words in their head when they read, you're kind of activating this area of the brain. And you notice, right, you can't just do this based on orthography alone because the ending rhymes are all the same, O-U-T-H, but we can take advantage of English being a very irregular language, and south obviously rhymes with mouth and not with youth, okay? When we look at some of the evidence of where this happens in the brain, you can see this posterior perisylvian region is really popping up here as being important for accessing or retrieving that information. So this is in panel A is functional neuroimaging studies in healthy adults, where it's related to that phonological retrieval. This is lesion data from stroke patients where when this is damaged, they have a hard time doing that rhyming task. Okay, and again, this is sites where if you stimulate it in patients that are undergoing surgery, this is where you get phonologic errors during reading out loud. So they're selecting the wrong phoneme when they're saying something. So an example of that is if I'm trying to read the word sights and maybe I say kites. Okay, I selected the wrong sound and I made a phonological paraphasia. Right. So the area that's really important for this is this posterior perisylvian region. Okay. And again, the sylvian fissure. Okay. And we have the supramarginal gyrus up here, dorsal to it or superior. You've got the superior temporal gyrus, and then again, just bounding it on the bottom is the superior temporal sulcus. And it's really this posterior superior temporal gyrus that's really important. If you can remember, just anterior to this region is where I'd be perceiving phonological information. And that makes sense that they would have very close cortical real estate for phonological information. I kept some of this frontal lobe area. So again, this would be the pars opercularis of the inferior frontal gyrus that's highlighted right here. And that's really important for helping maintain and retrieve phonological information, right? So if you think about working memory tasks like digit span or remembering a telephone number, these two areas are probably going to be activated in concert, right? The frontal area telling the posterior area, hey, keep this information online. I'm going to need it in a little bit. Okay. And as you can see here, this is the precentral sulcus and that pars opercularis again. And again, to link it into patient data, this is from Gorno Tempini's work on the primary progressive aphasias. And you can see here in blue, highlighting again this posterior perisylvian region. This is the part of the brain that's damaged in patients with logopenic primary progressive aphasia, where they have a hard time kind of holding that phonological information and accessing those sounds. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about production here. So this is a very complex sensory motor task, right? It involves respiratory, laryngeals, and supraglottal vocal tract articulators that all work together. Underlying this complex motor act is the speech motor control system, and that integrates auditory and somatosensory motor information that are represented in different temporal, parietal, and frontal areas, along with associated subcortical structures, and this all helps produce fluent and intelligible speech. So I've got kind of the example of pa, ta, ka here, and these are just the different labels for making those things, like a bilabial involves both lips and things like that, right? And which is why often if you're testing articulatory agility, we use pa, ta, ka, because it gets the mouth in all places it needs to go, and you see how quickly they can do that. Okay, when we look at production, the main area, right, is the sensory motor area. Okay, so looking at, we've got the central sulcus kind of coming down here. If I can get the highlighter to work. Okay, and that's bounded on either side by the postcentral gyrus, which houses sensory information, somatosensory, and the precentral gyrus, which is really important for motor components, okay? And you can see that the area that's most important for doing production tasks is on the ventral side. And if you look here at the homunculus, that makes sense because you can see that these lips, motor, tongue, teeth area is here for somatosensory and motor, okay? That's why it's so important. And I left these two areas in here for speech sound recognition and retrieving sounds because as we talk, we are also listening to what we say and monitoring it and self-correcting it if we made a mistake, right? So earlier when I made that mistake about calling this a longitudinal fissure, which is incorrect, that's a long fissure that divides your brains into two halves, I heard that, right? And I corrected the error after a few attempts, okay? But that's the whole circuit that was working in action live, right, for you guys, okay? The other area that's really important for production are actually subcortical areas, okay? So let me erase some of the highlighting areas that I did earlier, although I suppose I could leave that. So the basal ganglia is important for part of production, particularly the striatum, which is the caudate nucleus up here, and the putamen. And then I also highlighted the insula because the insula is also involved in some of these processes as well as additional ones, okay? And if you get a stroke in these subcortical regions, often these patients will have production-based deficits, which also fits with what we see in non-fluent primary progressive aphasia, which is shown here in red. Okay, this is where they're having cell loss and atrophy, and they have very production-based deficits, okay? Becomes very telegraphic and difficult. I put this in here. This is involved in production and repetition and things like this. This is a superior longitudinal fasciculus, okay? Again, I'm highlighting it here in green. It runs front to back or anterior to posterior. And it helps transfer information of phonological codes, sensory motor information up into that motor area for articulation, okay? So you can kind of see it here in green, just tracking along. And these are just for reference so you know where you are when you're looking at the slices and the numbers down below. All right. You've probably heard one of those tracks called arcuate fasciculus. It's synonymous. There are 4 segments of the SLF. Arcuate fasciculus is synonymous with segment number 4, just so you know. All right. There's also retrieval and attention control and shifting, right? And this involves a large area of the frontal cortex is really important about that. You think about that with like executive processing and things like that. So it involves a lot of that. Here we've got the superior frontal gyrus and sulcus, the middle frontal gyrus, and then the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, and there I did label the pars triangularis, was involved in more general kind of control and retrieval. This area is going to be really active in people that are bilingual and shifting between languages, right? So as they're shifting between which language they're pulling for, this is a part of the brain that's going to be working a little bit harder to kind of do that task, as well as syntax is involved in some of these regions that have shown that the frontal area is involved, as well as other areas that I haven't highlighted as well. That's a more complicated task. The white matter tract that's really important for some of this is called the frontal ascendant tract or the fat tract, which is also involved. It connects the supplementary motor area down to the inferior frontal gyrus, okay? And it has been suggested to kind of involved in language function, particularly initiation and stuttering in that fluency aspect, okay? All right, watching my time here. I put this in here just for you guys to, this is a really good thing to learn, right? So this is that longitudinal fissure. This is the 2 hemispheres, okay? And if you can find, this is a superior frontal gyrus, and then right here, remember, is that superior frontal sulcus. If you can find that, you can follow that back to the precentral gyrus, okay? And now I know this is the precentral sulcus. This is the precentral gyrus. Now I know this is the central sulcus, and I can orient myself. So sometimes it's easier to find this sulcus and follow it down to find the motor area to kind of orient yourself to the brain. Okay. All right. And I'm going to leave and end on this slide before I get to the next one, which is just a basic cartoon summary of a lot of the language processes that we blitz through, some of their anatomical real estate. Right. So retrieval, that a lateral frontal area, speech sound articulation. So kind of ventral frontal parietal areas in the motor and sensory cortex, phonological retrieval, posterior perisylvian, superior temporal gyrus, speech sound recognition, superior temporal gyrus and Heschel's, Semantic information, just kind of highlighted the part of the temporal lobe here in the angular gyrus, object recognition, here on that lateral occipital cortex, and then underneath that orthographic decoding, which would be underneath on the ventral side, that fusiform area. If you are interested in this topic, you want to read more about it, you want to study some of the things, a lot of the brain images I got from the Duvernoy Atlas, which is excellent. Blumenfeld is another excellent resource. And if you really like language, there is a huge tome that was published by and edited by Hickok and Small on the neuroanatomy of language. So at this point, I can go and answer questions or show you the please come again slide, however you guys want to do it.
Thank you. This was perfect. So yes, we do have a few questions, and just considering the time, we don't want to go past the hour. So one of the first question is, what are the key characteristics of patients with dyslexia?
It's tough, right? So it depends somewhat on the type of dyslexia. A lot of patients have a hard time linking the visual information that they see with the phonological information. So that white matter track is disrupted. There's some migrational differences that happen. In full disclosure, I'm not a developmental researcher, but that area with that phonological retrieval and some of that orthographic decoding are the two areas that are most implicated.
Yeah, and there was a similar question to this, was asking if in patients with dyslexia, if it's more prevalent among speakers of highly irregular languages like English.
I would not be able to really answer that question. I don't know right offhand. Italian is a fairly transparent language that doesn't have as many irregularities as English does. I don't know if that manifests in like a syllable disorder where they have a hard time keeping up with the syllables of the language, and I wouldn't know. Great question though.
Yeah, really tough questions. Another question is, can you speak to how syntax is represented in the brain?
Yeah, lots of places. It is implicated a lot in that frontal area, partly because after patients with frontal lobe lesions, they sometimes have a hard time with syntax and keeping things organized. But it is more of, I want to say, involving other areas as well, that are all kind of like online at a similar time.
Yep, perfect. Thank you. And then there's another neuroanatomical question. Can you describe an neuroanatomical basis of phonological loop dysfunction that is commonly seen in logopenic aphasia?
Sure. So those two areas that I talked about before. So these two regions would be most implicated. So this retrieval rehearsal part, I think I had a better slide for it. Where I'm maintaining it, right? And then the phonological area back here. So the store and the search and retrieval thing, and the whole thing becomes a loop, okay? Where it becomes a problem of me kind of directing attention that I need to keep that information online, as well as there's been eroding and atrophy in the actual codes themselves, right? So they have a hard time both directing and maintaining that information.
Yeah. There's another question. This one's a little bit more clinically based. So in patients with FTD who are nonverbal, but have some level of comprehension based, when you provide them with written instructions, how would you assess cognition? Do you have any favorite tests that could be used in these patients?
Mm-hmm. So limiting verbal output, right? You want to assess that, but also to kind of get a sense of where it's at, but then making modifications, right? So whether that involves writing or pointing or things that make less use of a verbal production, to see if those things are more spared, to get a sense at that. You know, the one test that comes to mind that has like the least amount of verbal is often like the TONI, right? The test of nonverbal intelligence, where there's no speaking at all, even from the examiner. It's just pointing and you make gestures. I sometimes use that in my aphasia patients, but it's tough. It's tough making some of these adjustments to your battery, especially on the fly if you don't see these a whole lot, and you know the clock is ticking, your patient is here. So yeah.
And a follow-up question to that, how would you communicate this to the family members that although they're nonverbal, they're able to comprehend written instructions and things like that?
Kind of exactly the way the question is posed is explaining where the breakdown is, giving examples of what that looks like for the patient and their family in day to day. So as an example, if I if I told the patient, you need to bring me the dishes, and they kind of are confused or have difficulty with that, then paraphrasing that to a written modality, or changing your sentence structure so you're always in the active tense, right? So bring me the dishes, or instead of, after you clear the table, I want you to bring the dishes and put them on the counter, right? So breaking down your sentences so they're a little bit shorter, and other modalities, pictures, pointing to things where you can kind of teach that, where patients learn a pointing mechanism as well.
And are there any like apps or tablets, computer, some sort of technology that could be a resource for family members in order to communicate with their loved one?
Sure. There are lots of language-based apps out there. I don't want to endorse any one. There are subscription-based apps like Constant Therapy, where patients pay a subscription and they can link with their speech therapist that will monitor their performance and set goals. There's other apps like Tactus, which you can buy and then you own. You can upload your own stimuli of pictures or things that are important to you as an individual, like family members or things like that. And there are other ones out there as well. Those are the two biggest language-based apps that I am familiar with.
Thank you. Sounds like there are resources available. Yeah. Well, that's it for today. We don't want to go past the hour. We thank you so much for giving this incredible talk. We know that language is a very complex processes, so I think this was really phenomenal for our trainees to get this level of information. So thank you.
Yeah. And our next talk.
Yes, and please join us next week. We are going to have a talk on visual spatial abilities by Dr. Russell Bauer from the University of Florida.